Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Fuhrman. Welcome to Vox Novus, the new voice. Imagine a therapist writing a prescription for Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, or Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson, or even a Shakespeare sonnet, as well as prescribing an anxiety medication. Might poetry be a vaccine for the emotions? My guest this week on Vox Novus, Dr. Norman Rosenthal, is that therapist. World-renowned for his research on seasonal affective disorder, SAD, and pioneering the light therapy to treat it, Dr. Rosenthal says that poetry is a potent medicine. He has researched other innovative psychiatric treatments and is the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller Transcendence, Healing and Transformation Through Transcendental Meditation, and the national bestseller Supermind. His website is normanrosenthal.com, and he joins me to discuss his path, his innovative work, and his new book, Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. Please join me in welcoming to Vox Novus Dr. Norman Rosenthal. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing this amazing work that you do.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, please share with our listeners, meeting you for the first time, your early path and how it led to medicine and psychiatry.
Well, I was really always interested in the human mind. Even at age 16, I wanted to become a research psychiatrist. But I also always wanted to be a writer because I was drawn to both the arts and the sciences. And in understanding the mind and working with the mind, it seemed to be a perfect nexus between these two areas, arts and science. And so it's been that I did my MD, came to the United States from South Africa, and went to the NIMH, where I did my research fellowship, and that's where I first developed the idea of seasonal affective disorder, people who get depressed regularly in the winter, and then treated it with light therapy in several controlled studies that has now been replicated all the world over. So that was my most interesting research contribution. But I wasn't done. I did other research things, research transcendental meditation, the effects of Botox on depression, all kinds of things that captured my imagination. And the latest thing to capture my imagination, really it's not that recent, it's been with me for a very long time, is the emotional power of poetry to heal and inspire.
And we're going to discuss that further. But before we start on that, let's talk a little more about SAD, S-A-D, seasonal affective disorder. For those who are not familiar with that, what is it like and how did you develop the treatment?
At its worst, it can be fairly disabling because when the days get short and dark, people with SAD begin to get low energy, withdraw from friends and family, oversleep, overeat, especially sweets and starches, gain weight, and really can be quite unable to work and enjoy their lives and be a partner to their spouse or companion. And it's very saddening, depressing in its worst form. And before we came along with the light therapy, many people went year after year. In our initial cohort, we had found that about 13 untreated depressions had occurred before they came to us for treatment because the treatment wasn't really understood, the condition wasn't understood. So we developed that concept. I described it in an original paper in the early 1980s. And we worked on developing a way of exposing people with SAD to bright light, which was really quite astonishing to see how well they did. And that has now been adopted, across the world now, North and South hemispheres. So that was the story. We're continuing to explore, and others are continuing to explore what might be the biological underpinnings, but that was the field that perhaps I am most proud of.
And approximately how many people in the United States are affected with this condition annually?
Approximately 15 million people in the United States, and that's an underestimate. And then for every one of those, there are 2 or 3 more who don't have it quite so badly, but still are less than their best during the winter months.
And do we have yet an understanding of the neurobiology taking place?
It seems to be related to the hypothalamus and the eye, the connections between the eye and the hypothalamus and other emotional areas of the brain, and mediated by, this is theoretical now, but based on a lot of science, the serotonin pathways in the brain, those same pathways that are stimulated by drugs like Prozac and other so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So light is a kind of natural form of Prozac, if you want to put it that way.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for that wonderful work that you've done on that. So how did you discover the innovation that poetry could be an effective therapy?
Well, I have all my work in psychiatry as a researcher has followed certain steps. Firstly, I will see a patient, an index patient or friend who has some phenomenon. And then I'll say, wow, that's really interesting. And then I'll look into my own mind and say, does this feel right? Have I felt that way myself? And if I do, then I start looking around at the other patients in my practice and in my people in my world, just to see, does this look like a general phenomenon? Now, this is a data collection process that's preliminary. It's not the same as a controlled study. No such controlled studies exist so far, but the mass of evidence favoring this as something really worth looking into is growing. So if I then can trace that sequence in the way in which I stumbled across this area, first a friend calls me late at night. He's lost somebody dear to him. And I struggle to figure out, how do I console him in a meaningful way? Not just to say, I'm sorry for your loss, because when something becomes more cliche, then it doesn't have the same impact. So I thought of it. He was a very cultured man. I said, there's an art to losing. And I heard him lighten up on the other end of the phone, and he said, do you know that poem? I said, no, I don't know what poem you're referring to. He said, well, I'll read it to you. And then he read a poem called One Art by Elizabeth Bishop that starts off, the art of losing isn't hard to master. So she had also depicted losing as an art. And it was a wonderful poem. And it's actually the first poem in my collection here. And as he kept reading, I could hear his tone increasing. He became more and more light-hearted in his tone. And by the end, he was almost laughing. And I felt the same mood lift. Of course, I hadn't been depressed to start with, so it wasn't quite so dramatic in me. But I thought, wow, can a poem really improve mood like that? And then so it went, and I then looked at myself and I thought, when I left South Africa, there was a poem called Letter to My Mother, all about a poet who moves to the north of Italy from the south, having left his family behind. And now she's old, his mother has aged, and he's writing to her and writing to really thank her for everything she did for him, including graciously letting him go north, without putting up any obstacles. And it was a beautiful poem. It is a beautiful poem, and it's also in this collection. And I read it again and again to myself and didn't fully understand why I was doing that. And what I realized was I had a great burden of sadness and guilt at leaving my family behind to go to a career in the United States. And this poem somehow, just knowing that someone else had had the same feelings and that he had put them down so beautifully, I think a lot of what poetry does is it helps you realize you're not alone, that there are other people out there who've had those same feelings, who've had those same thoughts. These are part of your human legacy, and that in itself is very soothing and very healing. So then I looked around, and everywhere I could find people who loved poems. One man who poo-pooed the idea, a colleague of mine, had actually stuck a poem behind his door in the office where nobody could see it, and so on and so forth. So it turns out that it's quite a widely experienced phenomenon. Not everybody responds to anything, really, but it's a widely experienced phenomenon that poetry can bring a lot of joy to people.
I'd like to follow up on the point where you talk about when someone approaches you with something, you try to embody it within yourself. How does that process work for you personally?
Well, I think it's key to empathy. Empathy actually comes in two forms. The one is an emotional empathy, and the other one is an intellectual empathy. If somebody came and said that they had a loss and that they were very sad, I would immediately, automatically feel sad. And then I would start sort of thinking, what did this person mean to him or her? If this was, let's say it was a woman and her father, I would say her father had sort of supported her all of her life. And she had so much debt of gratitude to him, and so much, she would call him perhaps and ask his advice or his opinion. And, now that's gone. That whole world that he embodied for her is gone. And so I would understand it at an emotional level. At an emotional level, if she began to cry, I would perhaps just pass her a box of Kleenex, just to show that I was there with her in spirit. And then I would start asking her what it means to her now not to have. So it's a complex mix of feelings and intellectual ideas that enable us to respond empathically to another human being. I might offer somebody a poem if it seemed appropriate.
You also shared that one of the elements of poetry as a healing modality is that the shared human experience reflected in the poem. What are some of the other elements of poetry that promote healing?
Well, I think that a poem can excite your imagination to think of possibilities that you hadn't imagined. It can give you new ideas, and it can give them to you in a very comforting, interesting way that excites your intellect and your imagination. That's what a good poem can do.
And you also say that you suggest that we approach poetry to derive the greatest benefits. There are certain techniques. How would you describe those?
Well, I would read a poem more than once, because at first reading, a poem is like it's got layers to it if it's a good poem. And it's like an archaeology of kind of digging, reading it again and again. And strangely, you get new insights every time you read a poem, the same poem. And one may wonder why. I mean, I see the poem on the page. It's right here in front of me. How come I'm continuing to get new benefits from it? But you do. And also read it aloud. Because the sound of a poem comes when somebody writes a great poem. It's not only the contents in the words, but it's the sound, it's the rhythm, it's the musicality. Listen to it online. Oftentimes you can get the very poet who wrote the poem is also reading it, and you can hear the reading of the poem. A couple that come to mind are Dylan Thomas with Do Not Go Gentle, which you cited up at the head of the hour. And there's another one by Edna St. Vincent Millay called Pity Me Not. Both of those we're fortunate enough to have readings by the poets.
And you also say that we should embrace the poems with all of our senses. How do we do that?
Well, there's a wonderful poem, for example, called Sea Fever, which is really a favorite of mine. And incidentally, if there are any of these poems you'd like me to read, I would be happy to do so, because it's difficult to talk about it in the third person without people actually getting the feel of it. But this poem is about a man's longing to get down to the sea again. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky. And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. So then he comes out and he describes all the things that he's missing. The salt spray, the whale, the wind like a whetted knife, and so on and so forth. So you're feeling it, you're smelling it, you're tasting the salt, you're seeing the light on the sea. The sea is like this vibrant entity. He brings it to life more than I've ever seen in another piece of writing. And you just want to go and pack your bag and go down to the sea. So it ends up being a very visceral experience since it's engaging all your senses.
Please share that entire poem with us. I think we'd love to hear it.
Sea Fever by John Masefield. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and the wheels kick and the wind's song and the white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face and a grey dawn breaking. I must go down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying and the flung spray and the blown spume and the seagulls crying. I must down to the seas again, to the vagrant gypsy life, to the Gulf's way and the whale's way where the wind's like a whetted knife. And all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover and a quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over.
That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I could actually feel the spray in my face as you were reading that, as someone who loves to go out to the sea. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Oh, my pleasure. It's quite remarkable, isn't it?
It really is. It really embodies, it is visceral. You can feel what that person is feeling and sharing as if you're there, right there with him by his side.
But one of the reasons I included it was not just because of the gorgeous description of the sea, but the quality of longing that often possesses us, that something is out there that we're just longing to go to and something is stopping us for some reason, an external or an internal impediment, but we're longing to do it, and we're longing to do it. And life is short. If you're longing to do something, as long as it's not terribly self-destructive, then maybe we shouldn't postpone everything. Like with this pandemic, I don't know about you, but I think back to the vacations I took and the things I did, and I'm very grateful that I did them, that I didn't wait, and then maybe something comes along that prevents you from doing something.
Absolutely. Giving you the opportunity to live life to its fullest with the capacity to do it and the circumstances to do it, for sure. You say that poetry can be a vaccine for the soul, especially now. Why especially now?
Well, I think that what a lot of us have dealt with, we've dealt with loss, we've dealt with deprivation, loneliness, uncertainty about the future. And I know personally, sitting with these beautiful poems through the pandemic has really strengthened my own sense of life being an enjoyable, delightful thing that we can grab, even if all these things are taken away from us. And of course, now things are opening up, but there's still uncertainty around. So if you can find one or more poem that you can really think about, read, even memorize. I think memorizing poems is an excellent exercise. Think about, read, memorize. It sits inside you. And then when you're lonely or when you're feeling bereft or sad for some reason, you can pull it out. You can pull out, as you said at the top of the hour, Emily Dickinson's Hope is the Thing with Feathers. That was a poem that when I first encountered it, I copied it and framed it and hung it on the wall. And it's very powerful, and it's a sort of message of hope. She compares hope to a bird.
My guest is Dr. Norman Rosenthal. He's the author of Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. Dr. Rosenthal, please share with our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your work.
Yes, my book is Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. It is available on Amazon for pre-order. It's coming out on May 4th. And also should be stocked in Barnes & Noble and other good independent bookstores. I love to give them a plug as well.
Absolutely.
My website is normanrosenthal.com, and it's got information about Poetry RX and all my other books and lots of blogs and interesting things for people to peruse. So normanrosenthal.com.
And we'll be back with more of Dr. Rosenthal and Poetry RX after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization. Their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
We've all felt left out. And for people who move to this country, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Back on Vox Novus, my guest this week is Dr. Norman Rosenthal. We're talking about his book, Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. And in the last segment, you were about to share a poem with us.
Yes, let me read Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, tell us a little bit about Emily Dickinson's life.
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because as I collected these 50 poems and put the poem out there, I think you should always see the poem first so that you can look at it with what we call the beginner's mind, the unprejudiced, untrammeled, unhustled, with preconception mind that we come at something as a child would, as though we're seeing it for the first time. Then I sort of explain a little bit of what people might want to know about the poem. And then I give some takeaways that they can take away, particular things that why I think this is a healing poem and useful in some way or comforting in some way. And then I have a piece about the poet, because in almost all these instances, one could match the poet with the poem and see how that poem was a natural outgrowth of that poet's mind, thinking processes, history. So with that in mind, Emily Dickinson was obviously a very brilliant student. She was well educated in Massachusetts, in Amherst, where her family was well established, and in fact was quite gregarious and was having a wonderful time in her late teens. But then things changed. She either became depressed or agoraphobic and went into isolation, self-imposed, and was known as the Belle of Amherst. She wasn't much seen. People who came to visit her, she would come to the edge of the staircase and talk to them down the staircase. And this happened for a long time. She never married. She had a sister-in-law with whom she had a very intense emotional connection. And that's most of what we know about her. She was very fiercely independent. She at one point was at a religious school, a seminary of sorts, and the principal said, "All good Christian girls, please stand up." And everybody stood up except for Emily. She remained seated. And she was very independent-minded. You know, she was very ambivalent about religion, because a lot of her poems have got the format of a hymn. They have a hymn-like quality. And yet she was very strongly influenced by religion, but at the same time she distanced herself from it in a formal way. Very few of her poems were published during her lifetime. They were too original. They weren't complete rhymes. You saw in the last poem, it said that perches in the soul, and then 2 lines on it says, and never stops at all. Mm-hmm. So all doesn't rhyme with soul. It's what they call a slant rhyme. It's not quite a rhyme. It's a little off. And that has a kind of very definite flavor. It's like you're eating something with sour cream. You know, sweet cream might be really tasty with raspberries maybe, but sour cream's got that little bit of piquancy, that little quality to it, and that's what a slant rhyme has. So she was ahead of her time. One editor published a few of her poems, but tried to straighten them out in ways that made them really bad. And so when she died, her sister and her sister-in-law found 1,800 little poems on small pieces of paper with the idiosyncratic punctuation and lettering that you can see an Emily Dickinson poem and you know it's her writing before you even read it, because it's so distinctive. That's how creative and original she was.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. We know that, for example, in meditation and in listening to music that helps with meditation, what's known as binaural beats or certain frequencies will help us get into that meditative state. Is there something about the rhythm and rhyme of poetry that has a similar effect?
You know, I would have no doubt. In fact, there is a study done in the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, Frankfurt, excuse me, but it's in Germany, where they actually hooked up people while they listened to, powerful poetry, and they found that these poems generated chills and goosebumps. They were so moving, and that the chills and goosebumps came at certain points, often at the end of the line, which is where the rhyming cadence would fall. So I wouldn't be surprised. And, a brilliant poet intuitively puts things at the end of the line or the end of the verse that kind of nails something in a way that gives you this kind of frisson that they've picked up with their machinery.
Absolutely. You had touched before upon the effects of the pandemic, social distancing, isolation, that people now are open to new, innovative ways to deal with stress and trauma, and are therefore more receptive to using poetry as a therapeutic tool, aren't they?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, it hasn't been studied, but I have seen the amount of interest in the subject. And this month, April, is National Poetry Month. But I've seen a lot of interest in the subject. It's been really a delightful revelation to see how well accepted the book has been, because I think now people are looking for ways to cheer themselves up, because anybody can sit down with a poem and read it aloud, read it to themselves, and get some payoff, get something out of it. A little creature like a bird with feathers that never stops singing, even when it's a bad storm. It never lets you down, your hope. So it's just the kind of message and just the kind of tool we need at a time like this.
You already shared two very powerful poets with Emily Dickinson and the gentleman who wrote about the sea. Are there other poets that stand out for you?
Oh, yes. Here's a poem that I would give to somebody who was trying to recover from a breakup. It's by the Nobel Prize winner Derek Walcott, one of the few Caribbean Nobel Prize winners. It's called Love After Love. May I read it?
Absolutely, please.
The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself, arriving at your own door in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Do you have one more?
I do. And of course, how can we not quote Dylan Thomas with his "Do not go gentle"?
Absolutely.
Do not go gentle into that good night, by Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men, who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learn too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Do you have poems that you personally have found to be therapeutic?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I found One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. I found the Hope is the Thing with Feathers. I found the Letter to My Mother. Many things. Another Emily Dickinson called There's a Certain Slant of Light Winter Afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. That poem fell out of an envelope of one of the people who responded to our initial advertisement for subjects for our SAD, Seasonal Affective Disorder Study. And somebody had typed it out and it fell out. And it so validated my belief that we were really onto something, because here Emily Dickinson, with her brilliance, had described winter depression, seasonal affective disorder, so beautifully, and attributed it to the certain slant of light, and explained that it affected you where the meanings are. None may see it, it's something hidden. And this is what a lot of my patients with mental illness say. I wish that there was some external defect that would cue people and give me the kind of sympathy that I'd get if I had a cast on my arm or a amputated leg or something. But this is a hidden trauma, a hidden grief, and because it's invisible, you don't get any of the same kind of sympathy, and I could really use that. So that was a poem that influenced me deeply. Another one that did was Keats's Much Have I Travelled in the Realms of Gold, which is the poem on first reading a new translation of Homer, on first reading Chapman's Homer, where he reads this new translation and it brings a whole world to life for him. And he compares it to the thrill of discovery that the conquistador got when he first viewed the Pacific Ocean, or the thrill of Herschel seeing the planet Uranus coming into view in his telescope, the thrill of discovery. And that was a thrill that I first experienced when I saw the very first patients responding to light. And somebody who had been very sluggish and virtually unable to move herself come in smiling and laughing and telling me she'd never felt like that in the winter ever. And the thrill of that. So the thrill of discovery, you see, it doesn't always have to be bad. It can be inspiring. It can be inspirational, like the poem by Emily Dickinson that said, go on. I was much the laughing stock from a lot of people who thought that seasonal affective disorder was ludicrous or trivial at best. And so when I saw this brilliant poet feeling and expressing the condition in such an eloquent way, it was very strengthening and reinforced my spirit to keep working.
And in addition to sharing these wonderful poems, the way they helped your patients, and also the history of the poet themselves and the lives of the poets themselves, you also share, for those of us who are not scholars about poetry, the formats of different poems and how they work.
Yes. Two poems can sound so different, but they have the same structure. And the structure must have been very conducive to the creativity. It must have made it easier in some ways because it provided a format by which a poet could work. One common example is the so-called Petrarchan sonnet. It's named for the Italian poet Petrarch, who used the sonnet. And it's got 8 lines and then 6 lines, an octet and a sestet. And in the first 8 lines, a problem is posed or a question is raised. And then in the last 6 lines, it's kind of answered, which is pretty wonderful. And they can be so different. It could be a love poem, but it could be a poem about somebody flying as high as he can in a jet plane, in a bomber, a Spitfire, high flight, which is one of the most famous aviation flights ever has got the same Petrarchan sonnet structure as How Do I Love Thee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So this incredibly versatile structure has provided the format for so many different kinds of poets and poems.
And do the various formats of the poems have a different effect on the patient?
They do, because the wonderful sonneteer was Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I've actually included 3 sonnets by her, and I can read them again and again, and they're so powerful and beautiful. They pack such a punch. They're just wonderful. And I think the structure of the poem gives you that particular thrill.
My guest is Dr. Norman Rosenthal. He's the author of Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. We'll be back with more of Dr. Rosenthal after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
Hey, Dad, your prescription will be ready in just a minute. Hey, Dad, your laundry will be ready in just a minute. Dad, your lunch will be ready in just a minute.
Hey, honey, why don't you take a minute?
When you help care for a loved one, you give them as much time as you can. But it's just as important to take time for yourself. AARP can help. Find free care guides to support you and your loved one at aarp.org/caregiving. That's aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Right now, our country feels divided, but there's a place where people are coming together.
I was nervous to talk to someone so different than me.
Me too.
Love Has No Labels and One Small Step are helping people with different political views, beliefs, and experiences connect through conversation, and it feels good.
This conversation gives me hope.
It gives me a lot of hope, too.
Take a step toward bringing our country and your community together. Start a conversation at lovehasnolabels.com/one small step. A message from StoryCorps, Love Has No Labels, and the Ad Council.
Back on Vox Novus, my guest this week is Dr. Norman Rosenthal. He's the author of Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. You were glowingly featured in Jane Brody's New York Times personal health column, and she wrote that she's not a huge fan of poetry. How did you win her over?
Well, I've known Miss Brody for many, many years and know her to be an absolutely consummate writer in the health area. I've read her columns and have been honored to be interviewed by her on a number of occasions. So she knows my work. And so I think she knows that I'm not flaky, that if I, study something or write a book about something, at least I have felt like there was something there. And she had told me when we last spoke, many months before this book was due to come out, that she doesn't like poetry, that poetry doesn't speak to her. And I thought, oh my, I was hoping she'd write a piece. And so when the time approached, I said, look, I really think this is worth your while to take a look at it. And she said, oh, well, we can wait. May is long away. You can wait till then. And then I suddenly got a note from her saying, "Change of plans. Are you available tomorrow to talk?" So, well, when Jane Brody asks if I'm available, the answer is going to be yes. And we did. And I shipped a PDF. I ran the PDF through the printer and came out with this very ugly, ungainly 3-ring binder that I FedExed to her. And I think the thing about Jane is that she's a very open-minded person. She'll look at something and say, is this something that's got potential? Is this something that could help my readers or help me? And to her credit, she was open-minded enough. She called a 94-year-old friend of hers who loved poetry and who found poetry a daily source of consolation and inspiration, and began to say to her many things that I had said in my book. And so she changed her mind, which is pretty wonderful, because for a lot of people, changing one's mind is not easy.
Absolutely.
But if you're open-minded, then you will be rewarded for that.
And to that point, in an ideal world, if everyone were to read a poem a day, what would happen?
Well, I think it really depends on the poem. It depends on the person. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I think poetry has a tremendous ability to help you experience all manner of human feelings: empathy, kindness, self-help, really. You listen to Love After Love. Comfort yourself. Look at yourself in your own mirror. Smile. Peel your image off the mirror and own it. And all these things are very strengthening, and that's why I've used them with patients, to strengthen people in the wake of a breakup, in the wake of a loss. When life is difficult, poems can really be a great comfort. And the Bible consists of a lot of poetry that is very comforting. The only poem I've included is Psalm 23, because obviously I did not want this to be a religious book, but that is so broad in its applicability that I didn't think it should offend anybody.
Absolutely. One of my personal life lessons was creating healthy boundaries, and to that end, I wrote a poem about it, and I called it The Healing Power of No. May I share that with you?
Of course, yes.
A time comes for choosing, rather than losing, the essence that makes us so. And in the bestowing, there's power in knowing the freedom that comes with no. When said with compassion, not angry in fashion, and letting the self-love flow, there's a sense of renewing and deep soul imbuing the awareness that comes with no. So with gentle voice and the power of choice and the courage to make it so, I'm still here, my friends. There's no means in this end, just the healing that comes with no.
Well, that's terrific, and good self-advice.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me with sharing that with you, because as a connoisseur of poetry, I thought you might enjoy that. So.
I did enjoy it. Thank you.
And just as words can heal, words can destroy. How can we enliven more creativity and diminish that destructiveness in the world today?
Well, I think if we notice it in our children or in young people, we just gently point out that maybe not everybody knows, or it's not intuitive, that words can be very hurtful. And oftentimes the person who is hurting is himself suffering and therefore isn't kind. People who feel bad aren't kind. They feel mean. And so to attend to the person, historically, a person who says something mean will get punished. But there may be a way to try to understand, where is that coming from? does he himself feel, the victim of bullying or even cyberbullying? Verbal abuse, being on the receiving end, is very painful and even has long-term effects that have been documented in the brain. So we need to sensitize people to that, and but treat the abuser with some compassion, because the chances are, if you just punish that person just gets angrier. Not to say there shouldn't be consequences, but there should be understanding as well.
Absolutely. As an interfaith minister, I've officiated many funerals for family and friends, and I've often used Mary Elizabeth Fry's "Do Not Stand by My Grave and Weep." You share the story of that poem in Poetry RX. How may poetry help us through grief?
Well, that actually is one of the most helpful poems when it comes to people who are in mourning, because we want to believe that we can hold on to something of the deceased, which we actually can. Our memory banks are full of them. Every time we see the snow or the leaves blowing or the birds in the trees, we think of times we spent with our loved one. And so there are a couple of poems in the collection, that being the chief one, but another one is Christina Rossetti's Remember, that encourages somebody to remember her when she's gone. And I talk about that, and I actually did a small survey of friends and asked them whether they had active memories of people that they cared about, and everybody did. I didn't really realize that there was this whole unseen world that people were carrying around inside them, that were the banks of their memories, that were such a comfort to them. And I've written about that because it struck me as quite wonderful, because I hadn't realized how prevalent it was.
And in Judaism, of course, the expression, "May their memory be for a blessing," so that that memory of that person is always with us, and in essence, they never truly die.
That's beautiful. I hadn't made that connection.
You're doing a virtual book event on May 6th with the David Lynch Foundation to benefit the Resilient Warrior Program. Tell us about that program and how you hope to stem the epidemic of veteran suicides.
Well, yes, and an epidemic it certainly is. An estimated 21 veterans commit suicide every day. The veterans of our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, still Vietnam, people killing themselves. And some of it is just the trauma and the aftermath, the voices that don't go away, the startle reflexes, the hypervigilance, and also the shutting down of connectedness. I've got one poem in my collection here, The Sentence by Anna Akhmatova, the famous Russian poet, talking about how shut down she is. She'd been very terribly traumatized during the Stalinist years in Russia. And so I early on started to think that transcendental meditation would be a really great treatment for this, because it both soothes and enlivens at the same time. And when I had my own clinical research organization, we did a pilot study. And then more recently, with my colleagues, we did a controlled study in San Diego at the VA hospital, and did find that TM was no worse than a gold standard treatment. So what we're doing now, and we, meaning the David Lynch Foundation, Bob Roth, and a whole host of very, very top-notch centers, we're doing a 9-center study of this intervention, transcendental meditation, compared with another kind of therapy that's used for PTSD. We're doing it all over the United States, and are eager to see whether we can replicate the finding that we had in San Diego.
Dr. Rosenthal, thank you for all of this wonderful work that you're doing on behalf of veterans, on behalf of those who are suffering all forms of emotional distress. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on your wonderful program.
My guest, Dr. Norman Rosenthal, he's the author of Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. Dr. Rosenthal, one more time, please tell our listeners where they may get your book and find out more about you and your amazing work.
Yes, thank you. The book is Poetry RX. It's available for order on Amazon, and it can be also purchased in some bookstores, including Barnes & Noble. And that's Poetry RX, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. My website, where you can find a lot more information, including the information about the virtual book signing event on May 6th that you mentioned, is normanrosenthal.com.
Dr. Rosenthal, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this wonderful work.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
And thank you for joining us on Vox Novus. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.